I found a Polaroid photograph of a corpse that no one living could have taken, and that was when I realized I wasn't alone in the prep room at 3 in the morning. I'd been working nights for 3 years without incident, but something had changed. Someone had kept a key. My name is Caleb Engstrom. I'm a licensed embalmer, 28 years old, and I've been doing this since I was 25. I worked my way through mortuary science at the University of Minnesota, got my license, and came back to Duluth because I wanted to be close to home. Proctor's just outside the city, about 15 minutes north on Highway 61, and when Holmgren and Sons Funeral Home advertised an opening, I applied immediately. They had a reputation. Old money. Established in 1963 by Gerald Holmgren, run by his son Vernon until 4 years ago, and now owned by Frank Chen, who bought the business and the building together, the kind of place where families trusted you with their worst day, their most vulnerable hour. I got the night shift, 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. prep work, because it paid better and because I liked the quiet. Dead people don't ask questions. They don't judge you. They just need someone to care for them with respect and attention. That's what I tell myself. That's what I've always believed. The funeral home itself is a Victorian mansion on East Superior Street, that strip where the city slopes down toward the harbor. Lake Superior sits 3 blocks away, gray and cold and alive with its own vast indifference. You can smell the water sometimes, especially in winter when the wind comes off the lake and cuts through everything. That mineral edge, that particular combination of iron and stone and ice. The building has big bay windows facing the street, ornate trim work, a discreet side entrance where grieving families use the family room on the 2nd floor to make arrangements and say their private goodbyes. But the basement, that's where the real work happens. That's where I spend my nights. The basement is all stainless steel and fluorescent light and the precise smell of formaldehyde and rose disinfectant. There's a reception area with filing cabinets, a walk-in cooler that holds 6 bodies, and the prep room itself, a single large space with 2 stainless steel tables, a sink station, overhead lights that run the full length, and locked storage for instruments and supplies. The prep room had a single door with a deadbolt lock. I had keys. The owner, Frank Chen, had keys. The other day shift embalmers had keys. That was supposed to be it. 3 people, no one else. I should have known better. In a building that old, in a city that industrial, the past never really leaves. It just waits for the lights to go out. For 3 years, nothing strange happened. I'd received the bodies after they'd been stored in the cooler, sometimes waiting hours between death and prep work. I'd make the incisions, the carotid artery and the internal jugular vein, and inject the arterial fluid methodically, watching the body's circulation receive the preservative solution that would slow decomposition, buy time, give families a chance to say goodbye. I'd do the restoration work. You spend hours on a single face, sometimes. You try to put people back together who've been broken by accidents, disease, age. You try to make them look like themselves, or like the best version of themselves that existed. You get to know them in a way that living people never will. There was a grandmother named Eleanor with hands so delicate they looked like cross-hatched paper, the kind of hands that had washed dishes for 70 years, that had held children and grandchildren. There was a young guy named Dennis, 23 years old, car accident on the I-35 heading toward Superior. His shoulder had a tattoo of a compass rose. I had to think about where he was going, what direction he'd been traveling. There was a woman named Patricia who'd been a teacher, Frank told me that, and her face had the kind of lines that came from smiling a lot. You learn things about people in that room that their families might not tell you or might not even know. You become a custodian of small, sacred details. Friday night in November, I finished prepping an elderly man named Walter Benedetti. He'd been 86, died of pneumonia in his sleep. His family, 2 adult children and his wife of 63 years, had come in the day before to make arrangements. They were specific about one thing. They requested that his hands be positioned at his sides, not folded on his chest. Some families want the hands folded. It's more traditional, more peaceful looking. But the Benedetti family had wanted them at his sides. I was very careful about this because you remember specific family requests. You honor them. I positioned each hand exactly as they'd asked, palm down, fingers slightly curled in a natural rest position, the way he might have looked if he'd been sleeping. I arranged his suit jacket, a navy pinstripe he'd apparently favored. I checked everything twice, the lighting, the positioning, the way his white hair framed his face. At 2:47 a.m., I locked the prep room. I know the exact time because I texted my girlfriend goodnight right after, told her I'd be home by 7 a.m. Saturday night, I came in at 10 p.m. for my shift. Routine. I turned on the lights in the basement hallway, checked the cooler, 2 new arrivals, both waiting for Sunday viewings, and then I went to the prep room to check on Walter before the viewing scheduled for the next afternoon. The lights were off. I turned them on, and there he was, and his hands were folded across his chest. I didn't touch him at first, I just stood there. My throat went tight. Maybe I'd made a mistake. Maybe I'd forgotten and actually folded them myself, my brain playing tricks, memory fabricating false certainty. But I knew I hadn't. You don't forget a specific family request like that. It matters. You remember it because families trust you with these small details, and the small details are what make the difference between a viewing that goes well and one that creates friction or confusion. So someone else had moved his hands, someone with access to a locked room in the basement of a funeral home at 3 in the morning. My hands were shaking. I checked the door lock, still secure. I checked the windows, sealed. The cooler, untouched. Nothing seemed disturbed. The body hadn't been harmed or disrespected in any obvious way. But someone had come into this room without permission in the middle of the night and repositioned a corpse. Then I went back and looked more carefully at Walter's hands. They weren't just folded casually. They'd been positioned with precision, thumbs overlapped, fingers arranged with care, in a way that took real deliberation and attention. This wasn't panic. This wasn't someone grabbing him in the dark. This was care. This was intimacy of a disturbing kind. And that's when I noticed something tucked under the shroud near Walter's hip. A Polaroid photograph. I pulled it out slowly. It showed Walter from directly above, hands folded exactly like they now were, photographed from inside the prep room. I could tell because the overhead lights were visible in the background, and I could see the reflection of the cooler door's stainless steel in the bottom corner. The flash had gone off. Someone had stood in that room with a Polaroid camera, an actual camera, not a phone, something that felt deliberate and antiquated, and taken a photograph of a corpse I'd prepared. I called Frank immediately. It was 10:47 p.m. He didn't answer. I called again, and again. Finally, at 11:15, he called me back, and I told him what I'd found. He was silent for a long moment. Then he said he'd be there in 20 minutes. While I waited, I didn't touch Walter or the photograph. I just sat in the break room upstairs and stared at the wall, feeling something open inside my chest that I didn't have a name for. Frank arrived, looking like someone who'd been pulled from sleep. He was disheveled, his hair uncombed, his shirt buttoned wrong. He went straight to the prep room, looked at Walter, looked at the Polaroid, and his face went white. He handed the photo to me carefully, like it might break. "Did you rekey the locks when you took over?" I asked him. "When you bought the business from Vernon Holmgren?" "Yes," he said, but he sounded uncertain. "3 of them. The front door, the family room, the side entrance." He paused. "But not the basement. I should have. I should have done them all, but Vernon said..." He stopped. He left the room, and I heard him going upstairs to the office. When he came back, he looked worse. The prep room door wasn't rekeyed. Vernon kept a master key from when the business was his. It should have been returned, but he shook his head. I didn't think to check. I didn't even ask for them back. Over the next 2 weeks, I found 3 more Polaroids. A woman named Patricia, her hands repositioned, her face photographed from different angles, from the right side, from the left, from above. I found them in the shroud folds, tucked into the casket lining, placed where only someone handling the body would find them. An elderly man named Robert, the photos showing him at rest, peaceful, with that same careful attention to angle and light. A younger woman named Sarah, and the photographs of her showed her from multiple angles, with careful lighting, almost like a professional portrait session. The Polaroids were dated on the back in fading ink, written in an unsteady hand. The dates were spread across months, September, July, October, some going back to May. This had been happening for a long time, not just once, not just an accident or a moment of confusion. This was a pattern. This was a deliberate practice. The intruder wasn't just moving hands or taking pictures for some incomprehensible reason. He was visiting. He was spending time alone with the dead, performing rituals we didn't understand, creating a collection. Frank found the shoebox. It was hidden in the maintenance closet near the basement office, pushed behind spare linens and cleaning supplies. Inside were dozens of Polaroid photographs, maybe 40 or 50, all dated, all showing bodies in various states of repose, all photographed with the same careful attention. Some showed repositioned hands, some showed faces from different angles, some seemed almost affectionate in their composition. Frank went pale when he opened it. He didn't show them all to me at first. He just sat down and held the box like it weighed more than it should have. Frank contacted the previous owner directly. Vernon Holmgren was 71 years old. He'd retired 4 years ago when he sold the business to Frank. Frank called him on a Thursday evening and asked, point blank, if he'd been coming to the funeral home, if he'd been taking photographs, if he still had a key. Vernon denied everything. He said he'd turned in his keys, said he hadn't been near the funeral home in years, said it was ridiculous and insulting to suggest it. But Frank didn't want the publicity. He didn't want the story getting out, that someone had breached security, that bodies had been handled by an unauthorized person, that families' arrangements had been altered. He didn't want to accuse an elderly man, a respected businessman in Duluth, of breaking and entering to stand alone with corpses in the middle of the night. What was that exactly? Not theft, no violence, no abuse, just a man in the dark with bodies and a camera. So Frank contacted the police, but he was vague about it. He made a report but didn't push. The police took everything down and moved the file to a lower priority. No forced entry, no theft. A family matter probably, a misunderstanding. So I installed a trail camera. A small one, motion-triggered, the kind hunters use to monitor deer populations and movement patterns. I bought it myself from a sporting goods store on Miller Trunk Highway in West Duluth. I mounted it inside a vent cover in the prep room, angled to capture the prep tables in the doorway. I told Frank what I'd done, and he didn't stop me. He just nodded. He looked relieved, actually, like someone else was finally taking responsibility. 43 hours of footage. That's what the camera captured over 1 week before our visitor came again. I watched it all in fast forward on my laptop in the staff break room, my coffee getting cold beside me, my stomach clenched tight. Hour after hour of nothing. Empty room, fluorescent lights reflecting off stainless steel, shapes under white sheets. Then, at 3:17 a.m. on a Tuesday night, the door opened. Vernon Holmgren moved slowly, carefully, like someone entering a sacred space. He was thin, wearing a cardigan sweater and pressed slacks, his white hair combed carefully. He checked over his shoulder before stepping inside, not rushed, familiar with the space. He carried a small canvas bag and a Polaroid camera, an old Polaroid Impulse, the kind that uses instant film. He set the bag down gently on the counter and took a moment, as if gathering himself. For the next 40 minutes, I watched him work. There was a body on the nearest table. A woman named Claire, 79, died of a stroke. Her hands had been positioned at her sides per family request. Vernon moved them gently, without violence, repositioning them to rest folded across her chest. He stood back and studied her. He adjusted the angle slightly, moving her wrists just a fraction. He raised the Polaroid camera and took photographs. 3 different shots, moving slightly to get different angles, documenting her face in repose, her hands, the way her hair fell. When the film ejected, he watched it develop, holding it carefully as the image emerged from the camera. Then he pulled up a chair from the corner and sat down beside the table. Just sat. For 22 minutes. I could see his lips moving. He was talking to her, talking to Claire. I don't know what he said. The camera doesn't have audio, but I watched his shoulders move, watched his hand reach out and hover above hers without touching, watched him lean back and stare at her face. At one point, he raised his hand to his face, and I think he was crying, but the image quality wasn't clear enough to be certain. He spoke for a long time. Sometimes he would gesture as if telling a story. Sometimes he would go very still. Once, he reached out and very gently adjusted a strand of her hair that had fallen across her face. When he finally stood, he placed the new Polaroids in a small shoebox on the shelf by the entrance, arranging them carefully with the others, stacking them like something precious, like a collection. He looked at the box for a long time. Then he looked back at Claire on the table, the body he'd just visited, the corpse he'd just said goodbye to. He raised his hand, almost in a wave. Then he turned and left, locking the door behind him with his master key. I felt something crack inside me watching that footage. This wasn't a burglar. This wasn't someone dangerous in the way I'd initially been afraid. Someone violent, someone who would hurt the bodies or the families. This was a man saying goodbye to corpses because he couldn't say goodbye to anything else. This was loneliness crystallized into an act. This was grief with nowhere else to go. I played the footage for Frank. We didn't speak for a long time afterward. He just watched Vernon on the screen, watched him sit, watched him cry, and his expression was something between horror and understanding. The police picked up Vernon Holmgren the next afternoon at his home in West Duluth, a small craftsman house near the Lakewood neighborhood. He admitted everything almost immediately. His wife, Margaret, had died 4 years ago. Heart failure, sudden, in the night. She'd been 68. Before Vernon retired from the funeral business, he'd embalmed her himself. He'd prepared her body with his own hands, performed all the rituals, made her look peaceful. Then the business was sold, and he lost access to his work, his routine, the thing that had given his life structure. The funeral happened. Margaret was buried, and he couldn't let her go. So he started coming back to the funeral home in the middle of the night, using the master key from his old set. He couldn't visit Margaret. She was gone. But he could visit the other bodies. He could perform small acts of care for them. He could reposition their hands, take their photographs, sit with them in the quiet hours, and talk to them about his wife, about loneliness, about the strange comfort of being near bodies in the dark. He said something to the police that stayed with me. He said, "At least they listen. At least they don't leave." The hands he moved, the photographs he took, they were his way of being present for people in their loneliness, and maybe also a way of managing his own. Vernon was charged with trespassing and breaking and entering, but there was no violence, no theft, no violation of the bodies themselves. The prosecutor felt wrong about pushing hard. The judge seemed to sympathize. He got probation, mandated therapy, and a restraining order from the funeral home and from Frank Chen personally. I don't know where Vernon is now. I don't know if he's still grieving his wife, or if the night visits, the photographs, the careful repositioning of hands gave him something he needed. Sometimes I wonder if he's okay. Sometimes I wonder if he found another way to be close to loss without violating other people's dead. Frank installed cameras in every room, prep, cooler, hallways, basement exits. He rekeyed every single lock and didn't hire anyone without a full background check. He created a protocol. No former employees or owners, no one who'd ever worked there before, retained access to any facility, ever. Security cameras cover every room where human bodies rest. The shoebox of Polaroids was given to Vernon's daughter, along with a note from Frank explaining what her father had done. I don't know if she looked at them or destroyed them. That was 2 years ago. I still work at Holmgren & Sons on East Superior Street. I still work the night shift, still spend my hours caring for the dead. The job is quieter now, but something has shifted inside me. I understand what Vernon was doing, and maybe that's the most disturbing part of all. That need to be near the dead because the living are too far away, because grief has locked you out of the world of the breathing. I see bodies differently now. They're not just remains to prepare. They're the last place where someone's loneliness ends up, and that's both an ending and, in a strange way, a kind of answer. But I keep the doors locked, always, and if I ever notice hands moved or something positioned differently than how I left it, I check the footage immediately. Because Vernon wasn't the only one with a key. There might be others. There might always be others. Every morning for 2 weeks, fresh flowers appeared on the casket in our locked viewing chapel. White lilies, always white lilies. Their stems were still wet, the leaves were still firm, and nobody, and I mean nobody, had been inside that chapel after we locked it down at 11 p.m. I know locked. I've worked in hospice for 9 years. I understand what locked means in a building where the living and the dead have to be kept separate by more than just time. My name is Renee Thibodeau. I'm a hospice chaplain, 34 years old, and I split my time between two places that look and feel like they were built from the same dark wood and old money. St. Elizabeth Hospital's hospice wing on Phelan Boulevard and Magnolia Rest Funeral Home on Calder Avenue in Beaumont, Texas. I conduct memorial services. I sit with families who are saying goodbye. I sometimes stay late into the evening, setting up the chapel for the next day's viewings, arranging chairs, making sure the lighting is soft, that the air doesn't smell like formaldehyde and fear. This matters because I'm not easily shaken by death. I've seen people take their last breath. I've held hands of strangers crossing into whatever comes next. I've said prayers in a dozen different traditions because grief doesn't care about denominational specifics. It needs witness, someone to say, yes, this person mattered. Yes, your loss is real. I grew up in Port Arthur, 20 minutes east, where the refineries glow at night. My parents thought I'd become a pastor. Instead, I went to Baylor, studied divinity, and learned that my calling was about being present, about sitting with people when they understand that grief doesn't end. It just becomes part of you, like a scar you stop noticing. But scars only stop hurting if you let them heal. Some people never do. Magnolia Rest is housed in a plantation-style mansion from the 1920s. 2 stories, white columns you can see from Calder Avenue, creaky hardwood floors that announce you every time you cross them. The viewing chapel is separate, connected by a covered breezeway. All weathered wood and settled humidity. After 100 years, the air between buildings feels thicker than it should. Gulf Coast air, anyway. Beaumont sits in what they call the petrochemical corridor. Refineries, chemical plants, all of it releasing invisible things into the atmosphere. The humidity traps it all. Even on dry days, you feel like you're breathing something heavy, something that's been settling in your lungs your whole life. The building had been audited for safety. Twice. Electrical upgraded in 1997, HVAC in 2004. But nobody ever really thinks of a 100-year-old mansion as something that needs defending. It's just old. It's just sad. It's just where people come when they've run out of time. The first Monday in March, around 8:15 a.m., Cheryl from the front desk called me into the chapel. She looked confused, worried, the kind of look staff gets when something is wrong, but they don't have words for it yet. There were lilies on the casket, fresh ones, beautiful ones, white petals just barely opened, not the dried flowers the family had brought, not the arrangements the florist had delivered, new flowers, placed directly on the mahogany casket lid. Did someone come in early? I asked. No, Cheryl said. I unlocked at 7 o'clock. These weren't here at 6:30 when I drove in. I always peek in. You know I do. I did know. Cheryl had been at Magnolia Rest for 16 years. She'd worked through 3 different funeral directors, 2 remodels. She was meticulous about routines, because routine was the only thing that made sense in a building full of people who'd lost control of everything. The casket belonged to a man named Robert Chen. He'd been a chemistry teacher at Beaumont Central High School. The service was scheduled for that afternoon. The family had specified no flowers. They wanted donations to cancer research instead. They were the kind of family that understood loss. I checked the alarm system myself. There's an access panel in the basement, a box that shows entry and exit times, sensor triggers, battery status, nothing. No motion sensors triggered between 11 p.m. and 7 a.m. No breaches. The system was connected directly to First Security's monitoring station on Pearl Street. They confirmed nobody had come in. They don't come in until after closing, Cheryl said, and they never touch anything in the chapel. You know the rule. She was right. Custodians came in after 9 p.m. They didn't go near the viewing chapel. That space was sacred. Robert's funeral went forward that afternoon. His daughter cried. His grandson played a Johnny Cash recording. The casket was closed, which was unusual. They'd planned an open viewing, but the daughter requested otherwise. He wouldn't recognize himself, she said. Cancer takes everything. After the family left, I stayed late, ostensibly doing paperwork. Really? I was waiting. The flowers appeared again the next morning, and the morning after that, and the morning after that. Fresh lilies, no matter which casket occupied the chapel. It didn't seem to matter whose funeral we were preparing for. The flowers appeared anyway. By the third day, I started staying late in earnest, sitting in the back office with lights off, just listening. Magnolia Rest has a rhythm at night. The old wood settles in creaks, cypress and live oak. At night, when the sun isn't feeding the structure, it contracts until the whole thing sounds like it's breathing. The refrigeration units in the basement hum their constant hum. 2 industrial units, running 24 hours, keeping the deceased in a state of indefinite pause. I understood the sounds of machinery keeping death suspended between biology and business. But around midnight on the 4th day, I heard something else. A soft sound, a scraping sound. It came from beneath the chapel, or rather, from inside the chapel, but underneath, from the floor itself. I sat very still in the dark office. I told myself it was normal. Settling foundation, rats maybe, pipes expanding. But I'd worked in funeral homes long enough to know that some sounds feel wrong before your brain can tell you why. This sound felt like purpose. It felt like movement with intention. It sounded like someone moving very carefully through a very small space. The next morning, there was candle wax on the pews. Fresh white wax pooled and dripped, still soft. We didn't light candles, I told Trevor, the funeral director. This family asked for no candles. Trevor checked his records. Nobody, he said, not since Monday. On the morning of the 6th day, Wednesday, I found something that changed everything. A chair pulled close to the casket. It had been moved from its usual place against the wall, positioned so that if you sat in it, you'd be facing the deceased directly. At the right angle to have a conversation, at the right angle to hold a vigil, at the right angle to pretend, for even just a few hours, that the person in the casket was still alive enough to listen. That's when I understood. This wasn't a security breach. This wasn't a ghost. This was a person, a real person, moving through our locked building like it was their home, like they belonged here more than we did. I should have called the police. That's what they told me later. At the statement taking, the follow-up interview, the incident report that got filed with Beaumont PD and First Security. They all said the same thing. You should have called immediately. You should have escalated. You should have understood that this was dangerous. But I'm a chaplain. I don't call the police on people in pain, not until I understand what they're grieving. On the 6th morning, I noticed something else when I got closer to the chapel. A perfume. Faint. It lingered on the pews where that pulled-up chair had been sitting. Something like gardenias mixed with something else. Talc, maybe, or powder. Something old. Something that smelled like a woman's bedroom in 1995. Something that smelled like the past still holding on because the present had become unbearable. I stood in that chapel, and I breathed it in, and something in my stomach shifted, because I recognized that smell. It wasn't familiar from my own life. It was familiar from the grief groups I used to facilitate at St. Elizabeth's before I moved to full-time work at Magnolia Rest. There was a woman who came to a grief support group about 18 months ago. Came for 6 weeks. That's all they offer, 6 weeks. And then they expect people to have processed their loss and moved back into normal life, and who always wore the same perfume. She sat in the back row. She didn't speak much, but when she did, it was about her husband. His name was Nico Marchetti. He'd been a sheet metal worker. He'd died of pancreatic cancer at age 46, and his wife had arranged his funeral here at Magnolia Rest. That was 18 months ago. That was before the flowers. That was before I started finding chairs pulled close to caskets. That was before I started hearing the scraping sounds at midnight. I stayed late on the 13th night, not hiding in the office this time. I stayed in the chapel that night. I sat in the front pew, in the dark, with the lights off and my hands folded like I was about to pray. Maybe I was. The chapel at Magnolia Rest is small, maybe 30 seats, arranged in 3 sections of pews. There's an altar at the front, though we don't call it that because the funeral home serves people of all religions. It's more of a platform, a stage, a place where bodies are displayed so the living can come and look and try to make peace with the fact that the body is all that's left. The soul or the spirit or whatever word you want to use, that part is already gone somewhere else. That part doesn't need the flowers. Around 2 a.m. I heard it, singing. A woman's voice, barely more than a whisper, but clear and trained. She was singing something in Italian, a lullaby maybe, something sad and old and familiar, something a mother might sing to a child, something a wife might sing to a husband who's dying and who won't wake up to hear the rest of the verse. It came from below the floor. I stood up. My heart was moving like a trapped bird, fast, panicked, looking for a way out. The singing stopped. For 30 seconds, maybe longer, there was perfect silence. The kind of silence that feels alive because there's someone on the other end of it, waiting to see what I'd do. Then I heard it again. Not singing this time. Humming. And the sound of movement, small movements, someone shifting weight, someone trying to be quiet but failing, because the human body can't be completely silent, not when you're alive, not when you still have fear. "Hello?" I called out, my chaplain voice, my safe voice, the voice I use when I'm asking someone if they want to pray. The humming stopped. Complete silence. "My name is Renee," I said. "I'm a chaplain here. I'm not going to hurt you, but I need to know you're safe." Nothing for a long moment. The air in the chapel felt like it was holding its breath. Then, "Is he still there?" A woman's voice, rough from disuse, from crying maybe, from singing too quietly for too long, from whispering to someone who couldn't hear her anymore. "Who?" I asked, but I already knew. I knew from the perfume. I knew from the way she loved him in the dark. "Robert? Is Robert in the casket?" My hands were shaking. "No," I said. "Robert left this morning. His family took him home. But there are others. There are always others here." The woman below made a sound, a break in her voice, like something inside her had cracked open and was trying to speak. "I thought it would be Nico," she said. "I thought if I waited long enough, if I came every night and brought him flowers and told him, I thought if I just kept doing the ritual, it would be Nico in the casket, not someone else, not always someone else." I sat back down in the pew. And for the next hour, I talked through the floor to Delia Marchetti about her husband, about how grief doesn't end when the funeral does, about how love doesn't accept a timeline, about how sometimes the hardest part isn't losing someone, it's accepting that you have to keep living in a world where they don't. The police found the panel behind cleaning supplies in the basement, a crawl space that opened into what used to be a coal chute, which connected to the boiler room in the basement of the main building. And in that boiler room, in the corner furthest from the heat and the noise, they found what Delia had built. A sleeping bag, arranged with military precision, a battery lantern, still on a nightstand made from a cardboard box, bottled water, dozens of them, stacked in careful rows like a tiny grocery store for one person, books, a journal with entries dating back 14 months, and a pile of men's clothing, shirts mostly. Blue Dickies work shirts, soft from washing, Nico's shirts, she had his name embroidered on some of them. Delia Marchetti was 44 years old. She'd lost her husband 18 months ago to pancreatic cancer. She'd attended every service at Magnolia Rest that she could, sitting in the back row, watching other families say goodbye to people they loved. After about 6 weeks, the funeral director had asked her to stop coming so often. It was making other families uncomfortable. It looked like obsession rather than grief. So she'd found another way. The coal chute had been sealed with plywood, but the plywood was old and soft and came away with pressure and time. The crawl space connected to the boiler room below the chapel building. She'd been coming to Magnolia Rest every night for over a year, bringing flowers, lighting candles, and talking to whoever was in the casket. Because in the darkness, in the hours when the building belonged only to the dead and the people who loved them, every casket was a chance to say goodbye to Nico again. She wasn't dangerous. The psychiatrist they brought in confirmed it, and I already knew it. Delia was devastated in a way that modern grief support, 6 weeks of a hospice group, one referral to a therapist, a pamphlet about moving forward, had never addressed. She was experiencing what the medical system called complicated grief, the kind that doesn't resolve, the kind that, without intervention, can hollow out a person's life completely. When they found her, she wasn't frightened. She was relieved. She'd been caught, and being caught meant she could finally stop hiding. The funeral home upgraded its security completely. An engineer specializing in historic buildings found 5 unprotected access points: the coal chute Delia used, a basement hatch on Pearl Street, a storm cellar window, a service entrance, and a gap where old plumbing had been removed. Built in 1923, before security protocols existed. Before we learned to lock our dead behind alarm and camera, they sealed everything, updated the alarm system, added cameras. They treated Magnolia Rest like a fortress, defending against the grief of the living. Delia spent 3 months in an inpatient psychiatric facility. She receives real grief support now, long-term, structured by someone trained to recognize that 6 weeks isn't enough. I called her case manager monthly for the first year, then quarterly. I watched her progress from hospitalization to intensive therapy to finally a weekly counselor she meets with in her apartment. Her crime, breaking and entering, trespassing, haunting, came from absolute need. She didn't break in to hurt anyone. She broke in because staying away would have meant accepting that Nico was gone. And she wasn't ready. I'm still a chaplain. I still work at St. Elizabeth Hospital in Magnolia Rest Funeral Home. But I've changed what I do in my grief groups. I follow up now. I don't let people disappear after 6 weeks with a pamphlet and a referral. I call them. I check in. I ask about the buildings they're visiting too often, and when someone comes back to a funeral home again and again, looking for a connection that's already gone, I notice. I reach out. I remember their names. I remember what they said about the people they lost. The flowers don't appear anymore. The chapel stays locked. The alarm system works perfectly now. And nothing gets in that isn't supposed to. But sometimes, especially on humid summer nights when the air feels thick enough to touch, when the Gulf Coast humidity makes you feel like you're swimming through atmosphere, I think about that coal chute. I think about the crawl space. I think about the sleeping bag arranged so carefully on the cold concrete floor of the boiler room. I think about a woman loving her husband so much that she couldn't accept reality, that the building where he'd been honored wasn't also the building where she could keep him forever. That's the kind of grief that hides itself. It doesn't knock on doors. It doesn't call for help. It finds the cracks in old buildings. It uses the infrastructure that was designed for something else entirely. It turns a funeral home into a home because anywhere your loved one has been becomes sacred. Any building that houses the dead should have a full structural audit, not just cameras on the doors, not just motion sensors in the main rooms. Someone should walk every basement, every attic, every forgotten tunnel and coal chute and storm cellar. Because grief will find those spaces, and it will make homes in the places we forget. Most people think security is about keeping danger out, but really, it's about acknowledging that grief is a form of danger too, not a threat, a danger, the kind that requires the same attention we give to locked doors and alarm sensors. Delia's doing better now. I hear from her occasionally. A Christmas card, a brief email. She's working with a long-term grief counselor. She visits Nico's grave every Sunday morning at 9 o'clock, like a religious practice, in the daylight, where people can see her holding on to what's left, where she can hold on to what's left without pretending, without hiding, without needing a basement and bottles of water and his old work shirts. And I check the locked chapel every morning before anyone else arrives, not because I'm afraid of flowers appearing, but because I'm afraid of what I might miss in the darkness, what else might be grieving beneath our feet. What other basements are already occupied by people trying to resurrect the dead through ritual and repetition and love that refuses to accept the rules we've created about when mourning is supposed to end. My name is Dale Correa, and I've been the head groundskeeper at Whitfield Memorial Cemetery for 9 years. I was the one who figured out what was happening to the graves, and I still wish someone else had noticed first. I grew up in Fall River, born and raised. My father was a machinist. My mother worked in one of the textile mills on South Main Street before they mostly closed down in the 1990s. Fall River's a working-class town, the kind of place where people stay because they know it, because their families are buried here. Granite and brick, the Taunton River running through it like a vein, Portuguese bakeries on nearly every corner, the smell of custard tarts and fresh bread drifting into the street. That's where I'm from. My family goes back 4 generations in this city. That's why I took the cemetery job in the first place. Steady municipal work, good benefits, and I never had to leave. I could keep doing what my family's always done here. I wasn't always a groundskeeper. Started out as a landscape contractor, doing residential work, patios, garden walls, tree removal, but it was feast or famine. Summer you're booked solid, winter you're eating through whatever you saved. When I turned 32, I put in an application with the city. Whitfield Memorial was hiring a new head groundskeeper. They wanted someone with landscaping experience who understood soil, drainage, erosion control. I got it. Best decision I ever made. Whitfield Memorial sits on a hillside overlooking the Taunton River, right there on Robeson Street. 14 acres. I know every inch of it. The old sections date back to the 1840s. Worn granite stones, names weathered so smooth you have to run your fingers across them to read anything. The Correa family plot is up there too, though I don't spend much time thinking about that. The newer sections on the eastern slope have marble markers, plaques, flat stones you can mow right over, bronze vases bolted to pedestals, silk flowers that fade to nothing in the sun. I've mapped it all in my head over 9 years. Drainage patterns, soil composition, elevation changes. I know how earth settles. I know what a grave should look like 3 days after burial, a week after, a month after. I can walk through this place in the dark and know exactly where I am. Monday morning, October 3rd, I drove in at 6:30 like always. Clouds coming off the river, that particular damp that doesn't lift in Fall River until November. I took my usual route through the property, checking storm drains on Pleasant Street side, looking for any overnight damage from the weekend. We'd had heavy rain Saturday night. The ground was still soft. I was checking for erosion damage and washouts. And that's when I saw it. Section D, the burial from Saturday. The Hernandez family plot. The soil was wrong. I've packed earth over 300 bodies in 9 years. You develop an eye for it. The ground settles unevenly. Yes, water moves through the soil. Organic matter decomposes. The casket compresses as the wood gives way. But there's a pattern to it. Natural settling happens gradually, and it happens the same way every time. This grave had been disturbed and repacked, but the grade was slightly off, maybe half an inch higher on the east side than the west. The color of the top layer was different too, not quite the same darkness as the rest of the surrounding earth. Someone had opened that grave and put it back. I stood there for maybe 5 minutes, not moving, trying to convince myself I was wrong. I'd been doing this for 9 years. I knew what settled earth looked like. I knelt down, pressed my palm into the soil. It wasn't as compact as it should be. Too much air still trapped in it. Someone had dug this up recently. Maybe Friday night, maybe Saturday night. They'd tried to do a good job putting it back, but they weren't an expert. I was. I called my supervisor, told him what I found. He said to leave it alone, that families sometimes dig up caskets for additional items they forgot to include. A letter, a photo, something sentimental. But I knew that wasn't true. Families don't do that without permission from the funeral home, and we would have heard about it. We keep records of everything, every flower arrangement, every visitor sign-in, every modification to a grave. There was nothing in the Hernandez file, no request, no authorization. The next 3 days, nothing happened. I watched that grave like someone watching for a fever to break. I'd swing by Section D in the morning before I started work, check the grade, look for any further settling or disturbance. But the earth just sat there, holding whatever secret it was keeping. That's when I started checking the other recent burials, the past month's interments. Section C, a burial from late September. Same thing. Disturbed soil, repacked but wrong. Different color on top. The grade was off by maybe a 1/4 inch. I photographed both spots with my phone, time-stamped them, dated the photos with my location. My hands were shaking when I took those pictures. because what I was looking at meant someone was breaking into graves, someone was violating the dead. I spent that night researching, sat in my apartment on Milligan Street with a laptop I barely knew how to use, reading about grave robbing. 19th century robbers in Boston, in Providence, stealing bodies to sell to medical schools for dissection. But this wasn't that. This was somebody stealing personal possessions, stealing what families had deliberately chosen to leave with their dead. It felt more vicious. By Wednesday, I'd found a third grave. Same disturbance pattern. I started keeping a list. 4 graves, 5. I was spending 3 hours a day checking graves, photographing evidence, documenting dates and disturbance patterns. My actual groundskeeping work was falling behind. The grass needed cutting. There were drains to clear. But I couldn't stop looking. Then, Friday, Mrs. Patricia Hernandez came to see me at the cemetery office. She was a small woman, maybe 70, with gray hair and a braid and the kind of face that had grieved many times before, that had learned to carry sorrow without breaking. Her daughter had called her in a panic. They'd made a decision over the viewing. They wanted to bury her late husband's wedding ring with him. His name was Fernando. He'd wanted it buried with him, had said so explicitly in his final weeks. The family had been back and forth about it, removing the ring from his finger, placing it back, removing it again over the course of 3 days. That's how grief works. You're never sure if you're honoring someone's wishes or just indulging your own need to keep them close. But in the end, they decided to let him keep it. The funeral home had documented it. There was a form signed by Mrs. Hernandez and the funeral director. The ring was supposed to stay in the casket. But when Mrs. Hernandez called the funeral director on Friday and asked about confirming the ring would stay buried, to get a photo for the records, to have some proof that Fernando would rest with the symbol of his marriage, that's when the funeral director got confused, then concerned. Then he drove out to the cemetery and opened the grave. The ring was gone, and the casket had been opened. I showed Mrs. Hernandez my phone, the photos of the disturbed graves, the dates and times. She looked at each one with glasses she'd pulled from her purse, taking her time, not rushing. I watched her face change. Not from grief, she was already grieving, but from a different kind of pain. Violation. The kind of pain that comes from discovering your sorrow has been used as an opportunity. She asked me what I thought had happened, and I couldn't lie to her. I owed her the truth. Someone had been robbing the dead. Someone had been digging up caskets in the middle of the night and taking whatever they could find. Wedding rings, watches, bracelets, anything of value that families had chosen to send with their loved ones into the ground. I called the police that night. Officer Reyes came out on Saturday morning, took my statement, photographed the graves. He was young, maybe 40, with a cop's blank face that hides everything, but he didn't seem to understand the urgency of what I was telling him. These things happen, he said. Caskets get opened for various reasons. Families second-guess themselves. But I could see it in his eyes. He believed me. He could read the evidence just like I could. The next morning, Saturday, he came back with 2 detectives. One of them was named Chen. She was the one who actually listened. She spent an hour with me going over the cemetery grounds, marking the disturbed graves, asking me questions about the equipment, about who had access to the property, about the grounds after hours. By then, I'd noticed something else that made my blood go cold. Muddy boot prints near the old maintenance shed at the back of the property, way back near the tree line by the river. The lock on that shed had been broken recently. The splintering on the wood was still light-colored, still fresh. I'd never used that shed. It was just for old equipment storage, stuff that shouldn't have been kept in the main facility. Nobody went back there. Inside, someone had stashed a collection of tools, a pry bar, a leather work glove, a claw hammer, and something else that made my stomach drop completely. A key to the cemetery's mini excavator. Our excavator. The one we used for digging and for site preparation work. It was a Kubota. Big yellow machine, diesel engine, hydraulic arm with a bucket. Easy to operate once you knew how. Easy to modify a key for if you'd worked with one before. The detectives checked the equipment log. Someone had been taking the excavator out at night. The engine showed recent use. The records showed operations on nights nobody was supposed to be here. Wednesday night. Thursday night. Friday night. The engine was still warm when we checked it Saturday afternoon. We all understood at once, whoever was doing this had access to a key, a copied key, someone who'd worked here before, someone who knew the property. I didn't sleep that Friday night. I sat in my truck in the cemetery parking lot by the equipment yard, watching. The moon was half full, enough light to see by. My thermos had gone cold by midnight. At 1:47 a.m., the excavator's headlights came on, yellow light cutting through the darkness. I knew exactly who it was before I even saw his face. I'd worked with Owen Pruitt for about 18 months before he was fired. He was a gravedigger, that's what they called them, even though most of the actual digging was done by the excavator. Owen's job was to operate it, to do the detail work, to make sure graves were the right depth and dimension, to make sure caskets were positioned properly. He was competent enough when he was sober, but that wasn't often. Drunk on the job, showing up late, cutting corners. He had a gambling problem. He'd talk about it sometimes, looking haunted, like he owed money he couldn't pay back, like people were coming for him. The cemetery fired him 3 years ago, and I hadn't thought about him in years, but it was definitely Owen in that excavator. I recognized the way he moved, the specific jerky movements of his hands, the way he sat too close to the steering wheel like he needed to see better. He didn't see my truck. I called 911 before I did anything else, kept the line open while I watched him work. He dug down to a casket buried on Saturday, some elderly woman from a family I recognized from their plot marker. The gold and black vase was still there, flowers already browning. He had a system, I could see that immediately. Careful excavation, no damage to the surrounding ground, no damage to the casket itself. A portable work light clipped to the front of his shirt, shining down into the grave like he was looking into somebody's open mouth. He operated the excavator with surprising precision, not too much, not too little, stopping just at the right depth. Then he cut the engine and climbed down into the grave with that pry bar. He opened the casket with movements that looked practiced, moved slowly, like he'd done this many times before, like this was routine. He reached in, pulled out something that glinted in the work light. A bracelet, I think. Or maybe multiple pieces, rings. He put them in a cloth bag he had hanging from his belt, careful and methodical. Then he stood there for a moment, looking down at whatever was in that casket, at the body of an elderly woman he'd never known. He closed the casket carefully. That was the moment I remember most clearly, how gently he closed it, like he was tucking a child into bed. Then he climbed out of the grave, fired up the excavator again, and started backfilling. The bucket moved in smooth arcs, moving earth back into the void, covering it up, making it look like nothing had ever happened. The whole process took 45 minutes. I watched every second of it, every single second. The police arrived silent, no sirens, just cars with their lights off pulling into the cemetery parking area. Owen didn't even know they were there until they had him on the ground. Officers pulled him out of the excavator cab, threw him down in the soft cemetery earth. He struggled, shouted something about needing the money, about debts, about collectors. But that part feels like a blur now. Officer Reyes handcuffed him, read him his rights, and put him in the back of a patrol car. I could see Owen's face in the light of the patrol car interior. He looked hollow, used up, like something had already died inside him long before anyone arrested him. The detectives found Owen had stolen from 43 graves over 5 months. Rings, watches, bracelets, military medals, purple hearts, gold bands, precious stones. He'd sold most of it to pawn shops in Providence, places he'd probably already been going because of his gambling debts. The total haul was around $30,000. Enough to pay off his immediate creditors, maybe. But not enough to solve whatever he actually needed solved. They arrested him that night. Burglary from a place of burial, criminal mischief, trespassing, unauthorized use of municipal equipment. He's still in Plymouth County Jail waiting for trial. I don't know what happened to him after that. I don't ask about it. I don't want to know. But that's not the part that keeps me awake at night. The part that keeps me awake is that I didn't catch it sooner. 9 years of walking those 14 acres, 9 years of knowing every inch of the grounds, every drainage pattern, every section, every family plot. I know the cemetery better than my own house, and it took me 5 months to notice. 5 months of grave robbing on my property. 5 months of families not knowing that their loved ones had been violated, opened up, picked through like garbage. 5 months of that grave in Section D with its slightly wrong grade, and I almost convinced myself I was making it up. I almost let it go. I think about that sometimes, how close I came to ignoring it, how close we came to Owen getting away with this, to him just vanishing one night, moving to some other town, some other cemetery, and starting over. How many more families would have experienced what the Hernandez family experienced, the cold shock of realizing their grief had been used against them? I changed my routine after that. I do a post-burial site inspection in the first week now, again at 2 weeks and again at a month. I photograph the soil settlement. I check for any signs of disturbance. The cemetery installed motion-activated cameras on all the equipment, the excavator, the backhoe, the mower. The director changed every lock and recovered every key from Owen's time working there. We made Whitfield the first funeral home in Fall River to have a formal security protocol for the grounds. We've had a lot of other funeral homes call asking for our documentation. They're worried now. They're all worried now. I tell people now, if you're burying something valuable with your loved one, document it, photograph it, get written confirmation from the funeral home. Know that there are people who see death as an opportunity. Not out of malice, but out of desperation. Desperation makes people dangerous. Grief makes families careless. And if you work at a cemetery, if you work anywhere that deals with the dead, pay attention to the small details. The grade of the soil, the color of the earth, the lock on the shed, muddy footprints where there shouldn't be footprints. These things matter. These details are how you protect people when they're most vulnerable, when they're grieving, when they can't protect themselves. I still walk those 14 acres every morning. I still know every headstone, every drainage issue, every section. The Correa family plot is still up there on the north slope, overlooking the Taunton River. My parents are buried there. My grandparents, my great-aunt Maria. I'll be there someday, under that granite stone. And I'll be grateful to whoever checks on my grave, grateful to whoever walks those grounds and pays attention to the details, grateful to whoever watches for disturbance, grateful to whoever remembers that protecting the dead is protecting the living too. Because grieving people are vulnerable. They're not thinking clearly. They're not protecting themselves. Somebody has to do it for them. But now I understand something I didn't before. Knowing a place isn't the same as protecting it. Knowing isn't enough. You have to act on what you know. You have to call the police. You have to show people the evidence. You have to be willing to be the person who notices something wrong and says it out loud, even when it's easier to ignore it. That's my real regret. Not that I didn't catch it faster, but that I almost didn't say anything at all. I almost convinced myself I was mistaken. If Mrs. Hernandez hadn't called the funeral director asking about that ring, if she hadn't decided that she needed confirmation that her husband would rest peacefully, if she hadn't pushed for answers, Owen Pruitt would still be doing this, would still be opening graves, would still be taking from families who'd already lost everything. The graves need protecting. The grieving need protecting. And that job never ends. Not for 9 years. Not for 43 graves. Not even after someone goes to prison for it. Some knowledge comes in time. Sometimes it comes too late. And that's the thing that keeps me up at night, knowing exactly how close we came to being the ones who didn't figure it out in time.